Before I ever make a rough outline, beat sheet, or a scene list, there are three things I always do to set myself up for success. In this episode, I'll be sharing the first three steps. This will be a two-part episode, so in the next part, I will share the final four steps. But I'll be sharing the first three in this episode, why they matter to me, and how they keep my outline from falling apart half. I found that starting with these three things really helps me explore all of options for the story before I even start outlining. And this allows me to change my outline less. Although, don't get me wrong, I still change it quite a bit as I make decisions, but it doesn't become so exhausting because I'm constantly changing it. So I really like this. So I'll be sharing my exact pre-outlining process. Feel free to take what you like, leave the rest. I hope that implementing just one of these things helps make your process smoother and or more enjoyable. Welcome to the Fiction Refinery podcast. I'm Jennifer, a writer and developmental editor, and I'm here to share my writing process as I work on the first book that I intend to publish. I'm going to be sharing the lessons that I'm learning along the way and the insights that we can borrow from best-selling books and fellow writers. Grab your favorite hot beverage and let's dive into today's episode. First, I start by writing down whatever my story idea is and the tropes or other items that I want to incorporate. Usually at this point, my story idea is not a full premise. And at some point in time, either a problem or a character trait stood out to me, and I formed a basic story idea. Because of that I've been tossing around in my head for weeks, months, maybe years. But who's counting? This idea that I have is usually pretty high level, and I'm going to use an analogy to help make this make a little bit of sense because I don't know how else to describe it. So usually when I'm just getting started and I have this story idea that I've been tossing around in my head, I think that the story idea is more solid than it actually is. When I actually try to articulate it, I realize how insufficient it actually is, how intangible the idea actually is. So I think of it like a cloud. When you're on the ground looking up at the sky, the clouds look very tangible. If you are in an airplane and you're flying through the clouds, suddenly they don't look very tangible at all. It's just a bunch of water that's accumulated together in mist form, however that works. Apparently, I don't know very much about clouds, but it isn't solid. There's nothing to really touch. When you're in an airplane flying through the clouds or maybe on top of a mountain surrounded by clouds, you realize that the clouds aren't actually tangible. You can walk through. And when you're in one, you can't really tell. It just looks gray and it feels misty. Like there's nothing very magical about them. But when you look at them from the ground, they're beautiful and they look magical as they float through the sky. So that's my analogy. Take it for what it's worth. Might be bad, might be good. I don't know. So that's the analogy I have for it, because whenever I think about my story and I'm like playing out different scenarios in my head and kind of tossing the idea around, like it feels so tangible. It feels like great story idea. When it comes time for me to sit down and actually write it down, I can't quite grasp it. It's not actually an articulable idea. It's more of a feeling. And because of that, the first step in writing a story, I have found it to sometimes be the hardest, because I'm taking this idea and forcing it into something that is tangible and stateable. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to list everything that I want to include in the story. This could be tropes. This could be characters. This could be any character traits. It could be literally anything. Events, maybe some of the scenes that I've been tossing around in my head. Just whatever I really like that I am not sure I want to let go of. So for this story, the one that I'm working on, I wrote down I wanted to include a marriage of convenience. I wanted to include the enemies to lovers trope. I wanted there to be pirates. And I wanted there to be a persecution of magic wielders. Now, all of this is super vague, right? A persecution of magic wielders. Why are they being persecuted? I don't know. What kind of magic do they wield? I don't know. Is it all magic wielders or specific ones? I don't know. And I don't need to know at this point. Pirates. Who's a pirate? How does a pirate fit in with the magic wielders? How is this world even shaping? I have no idea. I don't need to know. Enemies to lovers. This is one of my favorite tropes. This one is absolutely a non-negotiable for me. This will be included. Even if I have to change everything else about the story, I will absolutely include enemies to lovers. Same thing with the marriage of convenience trope. I love this one. And I especially love it when it's combined with enemies to lovers. Because of this, I know that those two are definitely non-negotiables for me. Now, I have no idea how all of these things are going to fit together at this point, and who knows, maybe they don't fit together. But I'm going to write them down and just hold them there, hold some space for them as I work to put together the premise for the story. Now, the premise that I put together is probably not going to have anything to do with any of those things, so that's why I just went ahead and wrote them down, so I didn't feel like I had to make the premise include them. The premise of the story is going to be the main plot. So it's essentially going to be who the protagonist is, the main goal that they're trying to achieve, and what will happen if they don't achieve that goal. So when I first started brainstorming for this story, my premise was as follows. The protagonist must escape a horrid marriage proposition. Otherwise, her dreams will die. That was it. At one point, I changed it so that her life was at risk as well. I explored that. It didn't really work. So I've just left it for purposes of an example. I've just left it at her dreams will die. So that's what it was. And I'm going to be really honest. I struggled to make that work with all of the other elements. So something had to give. If I wanted to include those elements, the premise had to change. And that's totally fine. So the next thing that I do is that once I have the premise and I have my list of things that I would love to include, I need to start solving the puzzle. And the puzzle is, how do I create a story that includes all of those things that I really liked and this premise? How do I make them work together? And that is a tough question to answer. And I have found that I usually do actually have to start manipulating the pieces to see how they fit. So I start asking questions, usually. It's like, I want a marriage of convenience. Okay, why would the protagonist enter into a marriage of convenience? What would make the marriage convenient? I write down all of the answers I have for that question. And then I would ask, okay, why would the love interest, why would he enter into a marriage of convenience? What would make it convenient for him? I come up with all of the answers for that. And I do this for every single thing. I do this for every single idea that I want to make sure that I include. And then I start working through the premise as well. So I want to ask why it's important for her to escape this marriage. Is there anything else that the protagonist could be running from that would be more compelling, that might the inevitability of a marriage of convenience or an enemies to lovers, ending up on a pirate ship, like all of these things? Is there anything else that she could be running from or trying to achieve that would make these other things inevitable? And so I come up with all of those ideas. And then I'll also consider the stakes. We'll talk more about stakes later, but I might play around with, like I said, I played around with her life being at stake as one of the stakes. That did not pan out, so I did not use it in this example. And just so you know, like I said, My original idea is absolutely nothing like my current working premise. And I'm not going to make any promises that this premise that I have right now is going to be what I have when I start writing, because it could change again. But after doing all of that work, I ultimately realized that the premise that I had would not support the tropes and the other things that I wanted to include. So I had to make a choice. I could either adjust the idea to support the tropes and other things that I wanted to include, or I could change the tropes and the ideas to support the story idea. I chose to change the story idea, and I am so glad that I did. The story idea that I have now, I think, is much more compelling. Curious to hear what you have to say about it. You might think it sucks. I don't know. I think it's more compelling than my last one, at the very least. I can't promise it's good. I can't say it's good. I'm way too close to it, but I know that it's more compelling, at the very least. It was about at this point that I realized that the main plot was not going to be romantic, that the romantic plot was going to be a subplot. Because of this, I realized that the external plot would be the main plot. This really brought some of my ideas into focus, and it helped as I was creating the premise. So the final premise that I decided to go with is the inciting incident plus the protagonist plus the main story goal plus the stakes. You can use this exact template. It's very simple. As I showed you in my example, I usually just start with the protagonist, the main story goal, and the stakes before I try to come up with an inciting incident, just to see how things rock and roll. Once I'm happy with those three things, and it will seemingly allow me to tell the story that I want to tell, in this case, that means that I'll be able to include an enemies to lovers trope, marriage of convenience, pirates, and the persecution of magic wielders. So once I have this and I'm happy with it, I will add the inciting incident. And the inciting incident at this point in time is really just whatever I think will kick things off with a bang. It may not actually end up being the inciting incident, and I can always change it. So for the story that I'm working on now, it goes something like this. Marin, the protagonist, I have named her, must find a way to get to the capital and help her sister escape prison. That's the goal. Otherwise, her sister will be executed. Those are the stakes. Now, once I add the inciting incident, it looks like this. When Marin's sister is arrested and taken to the capital for trial, Marin must find a way to get to the capital and help her escape. Otherwise, her sister will be executed. Not much changed. In fact, nothing changed in that last part. Everything that I added is in that first portion of the sentence, the first dependent clause. That is the inciting incident that I added. And I did mention that I was going to touch on stakes. I could do an episode more in depth into stakes and what I think of story stakes and how I choose story stakes. But just to be incredibly clear, because these things may come up naturally as I continue sharing my process with you, I just really want to be clear about the stakes for the story. So the external stakes is that someone will die, and it's not the protagonist, it's her sister. And this internally represents a death of self for the protagonist. She is responsible for taking care of her sister, and it's her carelessness that gets her sister arrested. And if she does not right the wrong, her identity will be shattered. I say this because I believe that stakes always have to be death, whether it is a physical death or an external, irrevocable change to their life, essentially the death of a phase of life. And I just mentioned this because the external stakes that I have suggested so far is that Marin's sister will die. That impacts Marin 1,000%, but it's not her death. And I think that the stakes have to be personal. It has to be a personal death for the protagonist. So I just want it to be super clear that yes, the external stakes here is that Marin's sister is going to die. But that death will ultimately change Marin's external world. It will move her into a new phase of life, and it will forever close the door on the previous one. And because of that, it is a valid stake for the story. And moreover, Marin's identity is also at stake, and this is more internal. And it's really the death of an identity. She believes that she is a good, caring sister. A good, caring sister would not get her sister arrested and executed. So it creates conflict. She cannot be that if her sister dies. Turns out she might not be that at all because she let this horrible thing happen to her sister. And now she has to desperately try and save her from this fate. So I hope that helps you understand why I chose those story stakes instead of Marin's death, because it still does work, even though I'm not stating that it's Marin's death. So I think that it still works. If you don't, let me know why. I'm super curious. Okay, and then the last thing that I do, this is item number 3. I begin dumping all of my ideas into a document. This is everything that the story premise sparked. So any questions that I still have that would need to be answered to make this premise work. And then, of course, the rambling answers to those questions, because it's like stream of consciousness writing for me while I'm brainstorming these things. And so it's an absolute mess. I will ask questions again. So like earlier, I had explored why the love interest might enter into a marriage of convenience with the protagonist, and vice versa, why the protagonist might enter into a marriage of convenience with the love interest. And I've already explored those ideas, but I have this new premise now. If I have one of those ideas that I like and I'd like to use, I'll ask questions about it to make it make even more sense. Or I'll just ask the question again and explore new options. Maybe I'll do both. But the goal of this is to just come up with as many ideas as possible. I do not gatekeep my ideas. I will write down all the bad ideas. I will do it. I do not judge the ideas as I'm writing them. The goal is just to come up with as many as humanly possible. And I really do this until I feel like I no longer have anything else to consider. There you have it. Those are the first 3 things that I do before I start outlining. This process really helps me take a general idea for a story and turn it into an actual tangible premise that I can state and that I can start playing with. It gives me the foundation to continue exploring the premise. And without it, I really could explore endless options, and that would be fun. But if I ever wanted to actually start writing, I have to begin eliminating directions for the story. And that's ultimately what I'm doing, making decisions, exploring options, and making decisions. Currently, the premise that I shared in this episode is the premise that I am working with. Will it change? Maybe. I may refine it further as I dive deeper into outlining. But the story premise likely won't change too much from this point. If it does change drastically, there's probably an implication that I did not realize that does not work with something that is non-negotiable. Otherwise, I can just change the other thing. But I'm very happy with this story premise at the moment, and I'm very excited to continue. And in the next episode, it is part 2 of this, and I'm going to be sharing 3 more things that I do before I start outlining. Plus, there may or may not be a bonus one in there. Something that I have started recently that I've been enjoying. So I really hope that you have found this helpful. And if you try any of these 3 things, let me know in the comments or send me a DM on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram at Jen Floden. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Fiction Refinery podcast. Writing does not have to be a solitary journey. We are in this together. And if today's episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you subscribed and shared it with another writer who might need it. And as always, if you want more content like this, then be sure to subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, happy writing.